Today on ADG Pro, we're going back to SimCity 2000 to do a little digging into its mechanics. I mean, sure, once you get a city going in this thing, there's really not a lot of complications as to how to keep everything strong and stable, but it's getting to that point in the first place, which is often really tricky, given that you start with a relatively small amount of cash and get way less in return every year of in-game time as you're getting started. So, the goal for today is to focus primarily on money, as we try to figure out what things we can do to maximize our money-making potential. The way we're going to do this is by running the city from the same initial state multiple times with minor differences in either the budget or city structure to see what those changes do for us. But before we can even do that, we need to establish what our margin of error is. So here's the thing. There's a massive number of mechanics in play in this game, and random chance absolutely factors into many of them. So we need to figure out how big of a difference random chance makes, so that when we see a result, we can determine if significant changes have occurred, or if the result is within an expected range of possibilities, in which case we can assume no significant changes have occurred. To get our baseline, we're just going to make a very simple city, but in the process ensure that all the early demands are met. And this is because the maximum size the population can reach is capped based on what your city doesn't have, with a handful of things being demanded very early in the game, such as police stations, fire stations, hospitals, and grade schools. So our city's going to have all of those. I've also decided to power the city with hydroelectric dams, since they don't need to be replaced. I've added a water system, even though it's never required to water your city, mostly just to keep the water shortage messages from overriding any of the others we might find. And I won't be touching the budget right away, meaning the taxes are set at 7% and all funding is at 100%. Also, one extremely important thing to keep in mind early game is that there's a magic ratio you want to keep your zones balanced within. 4 residential for every 2 industrial for every 1 commercial. Now, the actual ratio is way more complicated than that, but when you're building with dense zones, this typically works out well enough. Now, if you go for light zoning instead, you'll typically only get around half the income, since light zones can't generate 2x2 or 3x3 structures. Plus, with light zones, you need slightly more industrial, since dense industrial can form 3x3 buildings with lower land values than the residential or commercial zones can. In any case, with everything built and the zoning established, I saved the state of the city and ran it for 50 years, 4 times in a row. Now, 50 years of simulation time actually passes pretty quickly on my computer, so it didn't take too long to get these results. Taking the initial balance of $7,199 into account, the first run of the simulation resulted in a city size of $6,090 and $10,901 of profit. The second run was the best, with a city size of $6,070 and $11,948 profit. The third run was the worst, with a city size of $6,040 and $9,750 profit, while the final run also ended with a city size of $6,040, but with $10,831 profit. Based on these results, we need to assume a margin of error of around 20% when doing these comparisons, which is considerable, so we need to smooth this out somewhat to get things more consistent. So for the next test, I built a second city, zoned the exact same way as the first, but far enough away that the two shouldn't have any major effect on each other. In fact, I didn't even connect them together with roads. Well, not yet anyways. For the next test, I wanted to look at the tax rate, as this is ultimately one of the biggest factors in terms of how much money you make. But how big of a factor is it, and how far can we push it and still turn a profit? I decided to test a huge range of tax rates, starting with 4% and ultimately going all the way up to 11%. Amazingly, even with just a 4% rate, the city turned a profit over the course of 50 years, raking in a total of $5,700, which admittedly is pitifully small for 50 years, given that we just doubled the city size. A 5% tax rate brings us up to $14,672 profit, 6% tax brings us up to $22,636 profit, and it seems every tax increase continues to push this number up and up. Well, heck, 9% taxes brought in the most money of all, with $42,802 of profit in 50 years. However, as soon as we give just one more tick to the tax rate and break into double digits, everything collapses. The shift from 9% taxes to 10% taxes just decimates the city. though granted, still manages to pull in a total profit of $16,180, and even an 11% tax rate managed a meager $3,529. However, you may have noticed I kept the crime and unemployment numbers listed during this test because I assumed that as taxes got far too oppressive to handle, both would go up. Well, sure enough, unemployment did indeed skyrocket, but crime dropped? Now true, the population numbers dropped like a stone too, but I find it curious that crime dropped faster, given that severe unemployment should theoretically lead to an increase in crime and yet didn't? Huh. Well, keep this in mind as we go forward, as it's the first sign of things to come. Also, just as a point of interest, I reran the initial margin of error test with 9% taxes instead of 7%, and ended up with a city size of only 5,880, but a total profit of $14,649. So yeah, it seems like at least for the early game, 9% tax is the way to go. Next up, I decided to see what kind of difference traffic and pollution would make on the numbers. And generally speaking, traffic and pollution levels do tie in together to some extent, and if you make your city with only roads, traffic is going to be excessive. So first, I wanted to do a baseline test, with taxes set at 9%, since it seemed we could get away with that without issue, and the baseline after 50 years of running the simulation ended with $43,779 in profit, pollution levels at 45, and traffic levels at 40. Next, I connected my two city sections together with some highways at a total cost of $5,140 and ran this leg of the simulation again. Now, this ultimately dropped pollution to 34 and traffic to 22, but only saw a profit of $40,403, which is well within our margin of error, but also lower, which suggests that traffic and pollution may not actually affect how many people want to stay in the city. So I went one step further and introduced a whole bunch of bus stations, which cost an extra $2,000, and ran this section of the simulation one more time. This dropped pollution even further down to 29, and traffic plummeted to a mere 3. But the cost of running the bus stops dropped the total profit substantially down to only $28,415. So it seems people in the SimCity world really don't seem to care about traffic and pollution? Wonder what else they don't care about. Well, next up we're doing the ordinances. Now, there's a ton of ordinances, so before I decide to waste time testing them individually, I decided to see just what sort of overall effect they would have. Now first, I established a baseline with no ordinances in place over a span of 50 years, given that we have highways and buses now, seeing a total profit of $26,359. Next, I decided to try running the simulation with only the income-generating ordinances, since supposedly these would have negative impacts on the city. Now sure enough, they technically do, but only in so much as to what size the city wanted to stay around, as the size of the city shrunk by 25% with those ordinances in place. But the profit generated was $23,657, which is fairly comparable to what we ended up with prior, yet at the same time, the crime rate stayed the same despite the drop in population, and pollution levels also dropped slightly. I'm kinda curious. Next up, I tried running the simulation with only the expense-generating ordinances in place, which there are a ton of. Now, this resulted in a profit of only $2,772 over a 50-year span, but cut both pollution and crime down by a third, while raising both the health and education level of the city by a couple points. I mean, those are good traits, but it took a lot of cash to make it happen. So I did one more run with all ordinances in effect, and while this increased the crime and reduced the population again, pollution stayed down, education and health were still up a couple points, and a profit of $9,268 was made. So I think we can establish, based on that testing, that there's no real need to test the ordinances individually because they really don't seem to have a positive effect on cash flow. At least, definitely not in the early game. And we're starting to get even more glimpses into the fact that those underlying stats for things like pollution and crime really don't seem to have any effect on our income, which is something we're going to put to the test in just a little. Still, it was bothering me that all of those extra numbers we spent so much time and cash trying to maximize when playing this game in the past really didn't seem to be doing much of anything positive for our income, so I figured it was time to really put this to the test with education. Now first, I set up a third city section, again with the same 4-2-1 mentality for residential versus industrial versus commercial, but I built this section a little differently so that it could accommodate a college without too many issues, plus I was getting prepared to plop down libraries and a museum as well. I figured an educated populace might make for a more profitable one, but I didn't want to get too far ahead of myself. And once I had things set without placing the extra education facilities, I did a quick run of the simulation to see if any more city size demands were going to be hit, and sure enough, I hit the airport requirement. Yes, the airport requirement actually comes into place sooner than the seaport, and even the college. So I reloaded the initial state I had set up and plopped in an airport. And by the way, with seaports and airports, one trick if you're having trouble getting them to form docks and runways respectively is to throw some power lines throughout the zone, since this will ensure there's enough power flowing through for these structures to form properly. Also, seaport docks need deep water to form. Placing shallow water with the water tool isn't going to cut it. Also, given that the age ranges of the population are being tracked, I decided to run this educational testing of the simulation for 100 years instead of 50. Plus I put a handful of ordinances in place, which I believe would help boost both the educational and health values of the city. However, my initial test for a baseline seemed a bit off, as the city size didn't go up. In fact, looking at the graphs, it seemed to spike for a moment, then slowly whittled back down for whatever reason. Well, even after I put the college and libraries and stuff in, it still didn't seem to help. This got me thinking that maybe the size of the city directly corresponds to how high of a tax rate you can set without scaring off citizens. So I tried running the simulation again with the college and libraries and museum in place, but with the tax rate set back down to 7%. And sure enough, this got the citizens to fill up the city appropriately. So that's actually really good to know, is that the physical size of the city directly correlates to how high of a tax rate you can set and get away with it. In any case, with the educational facilities in place, which I spent a total of $5,500 on, and tax back down to 7%, 100 years of running the sim only turned a profit of $6,532, which is pathetic, despite the fact that health went up a few points and education shot up over a dozen points to 98. So no, a smarter populace does not equate to a more profitable one. Or can it? See, something I haven't touched yet are the funding spinners, as you can reduce how much funding you give to city services such as police, fire, hospitals, etc. Now you can technically reduce the transit budget too, but even just a single percentage point of a drop will have the transit authority warning you in all caps that you're going to regret that decision. And rightfully so, as your roads will deteriorate into nothing rather quickly, even with 95% funding. So yeah, don't drop the transit budget. So to help push things along, I decided to try and fine-tune the budgets to the fire, hospital, and educational services, as these are easy to tweak given that the advisors can tell you right away if you're overtaxing the system or not from the funding levels that you set. But I gave myself some leeway all the same. I set fire coverage to 50%, hospitals to 50%, and for education, I went into the finer controls and set grade schools to 60% and colleges to 20%, as a single college can handle a much larger amount of people than a single grade school can. I left police where it was because I was planning to test that separately later. Now with these tweaks in place, running the simulation with the educational facilities present resulted in $38,822 of profit. But just to make absolutely sure, I went back and ran the simulation from the state again without the educational facilities, but also with the same budget changes, and this resulted in a profit of $38,979. So yeah, we've confirmed that making the population smarter does not make for a more profitable city. In fact, I was so frustrated with this, I decided, just for sake of argument, to see what would happen if I just completely defunded the police, dropping their finances to a mere 10%. Which, yes, I'm aware the actual methodology of defunding police services is way more complex and involves introducing specialized services to deal with things we shouldn't be calling armed police officers in to handle, but this isn't real life, this is a game. So here, all I have is a little UI spinner saying how much money I'm throwing at them. Suffice to say, with barely any money put into police services, the crime rate shot up in this leg of the simulation by nearly 300%. But guess what didn't suffer? The city size and the city coffers, as this tactic raked in a whopping $71,649 in profit without scaring off any of the citizens. And just to affirm that the population was completely okay with living in a crime-infested city, I went back to the very first state of the city and tried it with 9% taxes and 10% police funding, along with reducing the other services before, and this resulted in making $25,203 in the very first 50 years of the city, despite only reaching a city size of 5,410. So yeah, this was actually quite the revealing trek into SimCity 2000's mechanics, as we learned some very important things. 1. You want to balance your residential, industrial, and commercial zones at a ratio of 4:2:1 in the early game, whereas I believe this shifts more towards commercial over industrial in the late game. 2. 9% is the maximum tax rate you can profit from, which goes down as the physical size of the city increases. But most importantly, 3. Apart from taxes, city size, and meeting demands, nothing else matters. Education, health, crime, pollution, traffic, while these values are all being tracked, they don't seem to make any sort of real difference in how things play out from a profitability perspective, and are mostly there just to challenge the player to keep these in check without going broke. But if you want to make money, you just need to ignore them. Now true, there are some drawbacks to ignoring them, which we can absolutely verify, specifically in regards to dense zoning. See, the way the game decides the likelihood of 2x2 and 3x3 structures forming inside dense zones is based on the land values. The higher the land values are in a given area, the more likely these structures can form. Though as stated before, industrial zones can form 3x3 structures with much lower land values than residential and commercial zones. Land value directly correlates to these seemingly superfluous numbers, and we can even see this in action. If we set this city going here and let crime run rampant, then suddenly give the police all the funding they ever wanted, not only does the crime rate plummet in an instant, but land values go up at the same time. Heck, even if we keep tabs on pollution, we see pollution affects this too. And I should point out that even though we're looking at the graphs, which represent the averages for the city as a whole, the actual values are tracked on a per tile basis, so where you put things makes a considerable difference. But that is ultimately the only major difference is in land values. Higher land values simply mean 2x2 and 3x3 structures are more likely to show up, which support greater quantities of population, commerce, and industry than equivalent quantities of the smaller structures. 36 1x1 structures result in a smaller city size than 9 2x2 structures, which result in a smaller city size than 4 3x3 structures, all of which take up the same amount of space. So getting the land values up simply means you can squeeze more out of each individual tile. But as we demonstrated, the cost to make this happen is much higher than the income we can generate by not bothering. So early game, yeah, drop your service budgets and raise taxes and you'll get yourself some cash going easily, and then just go from there however you want. Keeping in mind you do have to meet demands to keep the city size growing. Anywho, that's all for today's ADG Pro video. A couple Saturdays from now, on February 12th, will be a standard Ancient DOS Games review, episode 296, and we're going to be covering a game made by a NASA software engineer, which means it's going to be good, right? Right? Maybe you'd better stay tuned just in case. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small selection of you guys.